Welcome to episode 2 of the Red Book podcast, a Tolkien podcast focused on exploring his legendarium in depth. Last time, I looked at the changing history of the Witch King of Angmar over Tolkien's drafts, and how his backstory and origins changing over the years had an effect on other figures, such as the wizards. Before getting into today's topic, I just want to say that this podcast is not only available on Spotify, but can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Very easy to find under the name The Red Book. I should also say that video versions of these podcast episodes do appear on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/theredbook. An excellent place if you want to discuss each episode with me and others. And finally, if you want to help support this podcast and my videos on YouTube exploring Tolkien's works, then you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/theredbook. In this episode, I'm going to discuss arguably the two greatest figures of evil during the time of the Lord of the Rings: Sauron, the Lord of the Rings himself, and Saruman the White, head of the Order of Wizards, the Istari. Is it a coincidence that these infamous tyrants were once Maiar servants of the Vala Aule? As pupils of Aule, is he responsible in any way for their fall? Through my years discussing Tolkien, it seems that many do blame Aule in some way. But I hope to explain the very nature of all three figures, and why it makes sense to me that Sauron and Saruman would share similar origins and a similar fall, as reformers and materialistic tyrants. I will discuss the fall of Sauron and Saruman, comparing it to the near fall of their former master Aule, highlighting how easy it is for such figures to fall to corruption. For those who may be unfamiliar with some terms I am using, both the Valar and the Maiar are of the race of the Ainur, the original beings created by the one, Eru Ilúvatar, spirits of his own thought, before the physical world itself was made. Each spirit granted some special insight into a part of Eru's mind. Of the Ainur we can categorize two groups, the Valar and the Maiar. The Valar, such as Melkor, Manwë, Ulmo, and Aule, who is important when it comes to what I'm discussing here, are the powers, the greatest of the spirits created by the One. Originally 15 in number, Melkor through his evil acts was no longer counted among them. The Maiar are the lesser spirits, though still great, helping the Valar shape the world, their servants and helpers. Their number is unknown, but among them you will find Sauron, Saruman, both relevant to this discussion, Gandalf, the Balrogs, and others irrelevant to this topic, such as Manwë's herald, Eonwë, and the mother of the elf, Luthien, of the tale Beren and Luthien, known as Melian. The Maiar are typically associated with one or more of the Valar, being of their people. Among those of his servants that have names, the greatest was that spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthor the Cruel. In his beginning he was of the Maiar of Aule, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In all the deeds of Melkor, the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth, and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void. The Silmarillion, Vala Quenta, of the enemies. Where better to start than the fall of Sauron? From a servant of Aule he fell into darkness, becoming a servant of the first Dark Lord, Melkor later known as Morgoth. Morgoth being the only one more feared than Sauron in Middle-earth. He was trusted with the command of the citadel Angband, the Hells of Iron, located in the Iron Mountains, the Ered Ingrin, in the north of Beleriand, while Melkor's original stronghold Utumno still stood. When Utumno was assaulted and Melkor taken to Valinor, Sauron managed to evade any capture and remained in Middle-earth, making things ready for his master's return. Notorious for evil deeds in the First Age, Sauron assaulted the Tower of Minas Tirith and the Isle of Tol Sirion where it stood, and the isle became known as the Isle of Werewolves, Tol in Gaurhoth. This was eventually taken from him when the elf Luthien and the Hound of Valinor, Huan, journeyed there when Luthien's love Beren was held captive. Sauron's defeat forcing him to flee to the forest under Nightshade, Tower Nufuin. Under Morgoth, Sauron fell so far into evil that he was the chief lieutenant of the Dark Lord, and we are told that Sauron was now become a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, Lord of Werewolves. His dominion was torment. The Silmarillion, Chapter 18, of the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. And when Morgoth's reign of terror ended in the War of Wrath, the conflict to end the First Age of Middle-earth, Sauron rose in the Second Age as the chief foe of elves and men, a position that lasted until his defeat in the War of the Ring in the Third Age, when the one ring he poured so much of his power into was unmade, reducing Sauron to an impotent spirit, unable to trouble the world again. But I'm sure you all know that already. What led to his fall, as nothing is evil in the beginning? As Tolkien says in Valaquenta, Sauron was a great craftsman of Aule's house, remaining mighty in the lore of that people, even after his fall. And with Aule being the Vala of what we can describe as the art of crafting, meaning his nature led him to being associated with natural substances, works, devices, and crafts. Sauron's credentials as a powerful figure when it comes to the materials of the earth should be apparent. The cause of Sauron's fall came from his virtue. As Tolkien says, he, Sauron, still had the relics of positive purposes that descended from the good of the nature in which he began. It had been his virtue, and therefore also the cause of his fall and of his relapse, that he loved order and coordination, and disliked all confusion and wasteful friction. The History of Middle-earth, Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring, Part 5, Myths Transformed. Disliking confusion and wasteful friction is by no means a bad thing, and Tolkien describes the love of coordination and order as Sauron's virtue. The difference between Sauron and his former master Aule, who I will discuss later, is that Sauron would want to achieve order and coordination with the least confusion and friction possible in order to achieve his own goals and designs, at the expense of the free will and individuality of other beings. Sauron would be the one to focus on the pleasure and desire of making, without thinking that the cost could ever be too great. This led Sauron to Melkor. It was the apparent will and power of Melkor to effect his designs quickly and masterfully that had first attracted Sauron to him. The History of Middle-earth, Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring, Part 5, Myths Transformed. Aule cannot be at fault for the nature and choices of Sauron. Sauron has the free will to make decisions related to his own gifts. And despite being his master and teacher, Aule has no authority to force Sauron into a certain way of thinking. beyond teaching the righteous path. It is up to Sauron to take that path and live with the consequences of his own decisions. Sauron differs from the likes of the Balrogs, other Maiar that attuned themselves to Melkor in the earliest of days, falling with him into darkness, becoming his dread servants, his demons of might, terrors of flame and shadow. They seemingly fell under the sway of Melkor before serving any other master, being naturally drawn to him as a mighty spirit, moths to the flame. For of the Maiar, many were drawn to his splendour in the days of his greatness, and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness, and others he corrupted afterwards to his service, with lies and treacherous gifts. Dreadful among these spirits were the Valaraukar, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. The Silmarillion Valaquenta of the enemies. Sauron joined Melkor of his own will, after serving another, desiring the gifts of power and authority that he would be granted, all in order to fulfill his own desires and designs to the greatest effect as swiftly as possible. And Tolkien even tells us in letter 153, dated September 1954, that in the Second Age, Sauron was not wholly evil, unless all reformers desiring to hurry with reorganization and reconstruction are wholly evil, even before pride and the lust to exert their will eats them up. This reform, as Tolkien puts it, led to Sauron corrupting the elves of Eregion after he approached them. These elves, lore masters, were on the side of science and technology, as we would call it. They wanted knowledge that Sauron genuinely held, going as far as to refuse the warnings of wise figures like Elrond and Gil-galad. Sauron, originally desiring the reconstruction and reorganization of a broken Middle-earth following his master's downfall, fell back into evil, knowing what was best, even for others, desiring the power to force what was best onto everyone, his will becoming the way, order without needless friction. He fails to mention to the elves, through his deceitful appearance as a fair figure known as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, that with this new order he would be at the top as the one with power, attuning everything to him. Again, this is the difference between Sauron and his original master, a noble goal of reorganization and reconstruction becoming twisted and corrupted, becoming achievable by any means necessary, an attempt to overrule free will and seek lordship. He doesn't want to teach the elves for the beauty of Arda, for creativity's sake, nor to create a Middle-earth in an eternal unchanged state, to mimic the undying lands to the west, that the elves he was deceiving could not return to as exiles, but to elevate himself into a position of absolute authority in an unchanged world, a utopia only for himself, while all others serve him in a world that will never fall to decay through great rings of power he helps to make, ceaseless worship, and order through tyranny. His fall coming through squandering his gifts, misusing his talents, and treating inhabitants of the world as raw materials to be used and abused. And there is Sauron. In the Silmarillion and Tales of the First Age, Sauron was a being of Valinor perverted to the service of the enemy and becoming his chief captain and servant. He repents in fear when the first enemy is utterly defeated, but in the end does not do as was commanded, return to the judgment of the gods. He lingers in Middle-earth, very slowly, beginning with fair motives, the reorganizing and rehabilitation of the ruin of Middle-earth. Neglected by the gods, he becomes a reincarnation of evil and a thing lusting for complete power, and so consumed ever more fiercely with hate, especially of gods and elves. Letter 131, estimated to be written in late 1951.
Saruman is a wizard,
answered Treebeard.
More than that I cannot say. I do not know the story of wizards. They appeared first after the great ships came over the sea. If they came with the ships, I never can tell. Saruman was reckoned great among them, I believe. He gave up wandering about and minding the affairs of men and elves. Some time ago, you would call it a very long time ago, and he settled down at Angrenost, or Isengard as the men of Rohan call it. He was very quiet to begin with, but his fame began to grow. He was chosen to be the head of the White Council, they say, but that did not turn out too well. I wonder now if even then Saruman was not turning to evil ways.
The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, Book 3, Chapter 4, Treebeard. Unlike Treebeard, we do know the history of the wizards, and Saruman was once the head of their order. The Istari was the name of the order of the Maiar who arrived at Middle-earth, cloaked in the very real bodies of men, sent as peers of Sauron to aid Sauron's enemies against him. Tolkien's essay, The Istari, found in Unfinished Tales, is perhaps the greatest source of information on them. And it is there that we are told that even though all were Maiar, this does not necessarily mean they were of the same rank, just the same angelic order. Tolkien says that Saruman, as the chief of the Istari, must have been of higher Valinorian stature than the others, and this position of authority and responsibility led to Saruman falling from his high errand, becoming proud and impatient, enamoured of power, seeking to have his own will by force. In attempting to oust Sauron from his own position of power, Saruman sought to replace him, but became ensnared by that dark spirit, mightier than he. Saruman is not so different from Sauron in both his origin and fall. He too is described as a gifted servant of Aule, his names even translating as man of skill or cunning: Saruman, Curumo, and Curnir. I'm not suggesting that Saruman was equal to Sauron in what Tolkien called Valinorian stature, with Sauron arguably being one of the Maiar described as nigh as great as the Valar. Possibly. Still, Saruman was mighty in the lore of Aule's people, like Sauron, and he actively volunteered to come to Middle-earth, studying the arts and devices of Sauron, understanding his foe, again due to having a similar nature. Much like Sauron, Saruman would also seek to have his designs accomplished as swiftly as possible, being dismissive of those who would stand in the way of progress. His fall being related to the sin of pride and a severe lack of patience.
Yet he is great among the wise. He is a chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the Elven Rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making.
The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, Book 1, Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. Saruman is one to greatly admire skill and power over what someone like Gandalf in his wisdom would admire: hope and courage against adversity. To Saruman, the mightiest should lead the way, because they are mightiest. Who else would lead the weak? It just so happens that to Saruman, the wisest, those with authority, are the mightiest, immediately elevating himself as head of the Order of Wizards, as a power in Middle-earth, an authority. By his origins and position, he believes he has a right to rule. One aspect of Saruman's character I've always found to be interesting is the use of his devices. The Silmarils, created by the elf Fëanor, are representations of the light of the two trees of Valinor, purity and goodness. But Saruman turns to other, strange devices of Fëanor, such as the Palantiri, to serve as an advantage from his seat in the Tower of Orthanc in Isengard. These devices have always had a slightly dark streak to them in my own opinion, perhaps representing a desire for knowledge and power above that which one naturally has. Someone with a great enough will can use them to see far off, beyond normal capabilities, and like most objects of power, they can be twisted and abused by those with an evil will, as Sauron demonstrates in The Lord of the Rings, through the use of his own stolen Seeing Stone. A Silmaril can corrupt through a desire to cherish it, hold it, and claim it, but it cannot be corrupted. In fact, it will burn you in that case. The light of the two trees within, said to be representative of the authority, Eru. The Palantiri are not, and it is through the Seeing Stone of Orthanc that Saruman in his desire for knowledge and power is corrupted and daunted by the greater of the people of Aule, Sauron. Again, just like with Sauron, Aule cannot personally be blamed for Saruman's actions. The White Wizard admiring crafting and the use of devices, including people, to carry out his designs and plans. He is another to admire crafting in a way that is not crafting for the betterment of others, for the sake of beauty or enriching the created world, but to have his own will be done upon the world. This is all his own free will.
It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. As the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its courses, to control it. We can bide our time. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose. Knowledge, rule, order. All the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. There need not be, there would not be, any real change in our designs, only in our meat.
The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, Book 2, Chapter 2, The Council of Elrond. Saruman is another reformer, wishing to impose knowledge, rule, and order on all others. His so-called friends are weak, they are a hindrance. He believes he should have free rein to complete his own designs, even if the means of achieving them result in the suffering of others. It's all for a greater good. And again, like Sauron, it just so happens that he will be in the position of power. His speech to Gandalf is one that could have been attributed to Sauron, the strong ruling the weak, doing what is best for them at any cost, even through servitude or death. It is the violation of everything that would have been taught to him by his master. The gift of crafting, a physical manifestation of the power of creation, the use of the materials of the earth, has descended into viewing independent wills as pieces on a chessboard, a person's will becoming some raw material, utilized like wood from a felled tree. Nothing about Saruman's words to Gandalf seemed like anything but the abuse of power and authority. Two things he craved more of, but would lose, due to his actions in Middle-earth.
I think that I now understand what he is up to. He is plotting to become a power. He has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things, except as far as they serve him for the moment. And now it is clear that he is a black traitor.
The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, Book 3, Chapter 4, Treebeard. Aule has might little less than Ulmo. His lordship is over all the substances of which Arda is made. In the beginning, he wrought much in fellowship with Manwë and Ulmo, and the fashioning of all lands was his labour. He is a smith, and a master of all crafts, and he delights in works of skill, however small, as much as in the mighty building of old. His are the gems that lie deep in the earth, and the gold that is fair in the hand, no less than the walls of the mountains and the basins of the sea. The Noldor learned most of him, and he was ever their friend. Melkor was jealous of him, for Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers, and there was long strife between them, in which Melkor ever marred or undid the works of Aule. And Aule grew weary in repairing the tumults and disorders of Melkor. Both also desired to make things of their own that should be new and unthought of by others, and delighted in the praise of their skill. But Aule remained faithful to Eru, and submitted all that he did to his will, and he did not envy the works of others, but sought and gave counsel. The Silmarillion, Valaquenta, of the Valar. This description of Aule should tell us most of what we need to know about him, and just how similar and dissimilar he is to Sauron and Saruman. But I have described the fall of these prominent pupils. But what about the near fall of Aule? The Silmarillion gives us an account of the creation of the dwarves, with Aule being credited as their maker. He, like his pupils, was impatient, desiring the arrival of those he and the rest of the Ainur witnessed in the vision of the music of the Ainur, the children of Iluvatar, elves and men. In his impatience, he was unwilling to await the fulfillment of the designs of Eru, seeking learners to whom he could teach his lore and crafts. As elves and men were unclear in his mind, he fashioned the dwarves as they appear in the tale, but made them strong and unyielding to counteract the stain of Melkor that was found in the earth. Part of him knew that he perhaps should not have been doing this, as he wrought in secret away from the other Valar. It was then he made the first 7 fathers of the dwarves in a hall under the mountains in Middle-earth. Eru waited for Aule's work to be completed, and as the Valar began instructing dwarves of the speech he had devised for them, Eru confronted his own creation. Why hast thou done this? Why dost thou attempt a thing which thou knowest is beyond thy power and thy authority? For thou hast from me as a gift thy own being only, and no more, and therefore the creatures of thy hand and mind can live only by that being, moving when thou thinkest to move them, and if thy thought be elsewhere, standing idle. Is that thy desire? The Silmarillion, Chapter 2, of Aule and Yavanna. The father of dwarves was naive to what their making would mean to Eru. He had gone beyond the power of subcreation, and was attempting to create life in a way that only Eru can create. His intentions were good, and he was not attempting to make dwarves to lord over them, but to teach them the gifts he himself had been blessed with. This was not creating in a way that tied in with the designs of Eru, something Sauron would be guilty of. As I said, Aule's crime here was impatience, much like Saruman. It was the difference between knowledge and wisdom, a demonstration of the skill he held without needing to demonstrate it. Both his most infamous of students suffering from similar faults, but both failing to acknowledge them and better themselves through their experiences. Yet Aule wanted to love the dwarves, to have them perceive what Eru had made, with Arda being large enough for others to rejoice and dwell in. He immediately understands that his impatience led him to folly. He suffers from the same urge as his pupils, telling Eru that the making of things is in my heart, for my own making by thee. He made penance by offering the dwarves to Eru, and even offers to unmake them. And yes, by unmaking I mean destroy. At a time before they'd been granted souls and independence. Eru, of course, perceives the reasoning behind Aule's desires, and feels his humility. The dwarves are then blessed with independent life, something Aule could not grant them. They speak with their own voices. They flinch from the potential blow of Aule's hammer. How does he react to this gift and changing of what he has made? He is glad, lowering his hammer and saying, "May Eru bless my work and amend it." Aule's quality shines through, and not only the pure intentions behind the creation of the dwarves, even through impatience, but how he perceives them following Eru's blessing. Aule never states that the dwarves are his, that he is their king or creator. He would be a teacher, not a lord, and these dwarves would now belong to Arda itself, a glorious addition to the created world. Free beings to roam and live. I would even speculate based on Aule's reaction here that he would be proud of dwarves, but would praise Eru for what they would achieve and become over himself. His attitude towards crafting and living beings is so different from those shared by his fallen pupils. But his story with the dwarves also shows us that a materialistic view can lead to evil. Still, it can be overcome by understanding the great responsibility of those with power, the care they must take when treading a path that can so quickly lead to corruption. Mistakes are allowed, no one in the physical world being infallible. But learning from mistakes separates figures into those who manage to avoid corruption and those who fall deeper into it. As living beings, many races are not only dependent on the gift of a soul for their life, but the body that it inhabits, created by the very matter of Arda itself, as much a part of it as a river or mountain, or the gems under the earth created by Aule. It is no surprise that those associated so closely with the physical world, and of making and creating, would be the ones most likely to fall to corruption and evil, but also the ones most likely to create the greatest wonders the world would ever see. The act of crafting ties in with the gift of subcreation under Eru. Tolkien is not saying that the act of making or crafting is evil, or guaranteed to lead to it, but has the potential to lead to it, the potential for abuse of power and responsibility, for evil through the methods used and the motivation leading to the act of creation. It is a potential flaw for those who have creativity in their nature. The potential to become jealous and possessive of what you have made, or what others have made, to seek control, to become an authority. Many of the geniuses of creativity throughout the Legendarium fall into this category. Aule, Sauron, Saruman, Fëanor, Celebrimbor, and even Melkor, the prime example of a creative talent seeking complete control and creativity. a jealous tyrant claiming others' works as his own, even claiming the world itself as his. No desire to share in creation with others. The fall can lead to mass industrialization, machines and wheels, a focus on things over people. Aule represents crafting as it should be approached, aiding in the glory of Eru and Arda. Saruman and Sauron showing us what happens when things are taken too far. If you're unwilling or unable to learn from mistakes, accept responsibility. If you place others beneath you to fulfill your heart's desire, your designs that are apparently the be-all and end-all of existence. All these figures were gifted with the nature and ability to use the earth and its resources for good, to improve, and to enrich themselves and others. The fall is the dismissal of what could have been achieved. The world, its resources and inhabitants become tools. Forests burn for industry, slaves are made, and each tyrant believes the world is a better place according to their own point of view. The pupils of Aule are perhaps at the greatest risk of evil, but with the greatest potential to show their virtue and respect for the created world, which Aule and, we can assume, most of his pupils did. Saruman and Sauron showing us the devastation and destruction that is possible when such a position of authority and potential is twisted into something sinister, into something corrupted. Aule should have served as the example to them, a figure of authority willing to create for others, for the world, even almost falling himself, but recovering and welcoming a new wonder of creation into the world. He is not to blame for the actions of his pupils, both squandering their own gifts until becoming shadows of their former selves, unable to even interact fully with the world they wished to hoard and dominate. And we have reached the end of this episode. I always find discussions about Sauron and Saruman to be really interesting, and this episode will definitely be adapted into a traditional Red Book video on YouTube at a later date. I want to once again thank those who support this project on Patreon at patreon.com/theredbook, and to Phil Dragash for the use of his amazing Lord of the Rings soundscape project for several of the quotes I used here. If you have any feedback, questions, comments related to what I have discussed here, then Patreon and YouTube are the best places to get in touch, and you'll be able to find me on other social media sites under The Red Book. I hope you will all return for the next episode of the Red Book podcast. Thank you.